unusual sound. So when we're talking about the whip speech, I'm going to be assuming sort of a basic level of proficiency with BP debating. So I'm not saying you're going to know everything, but I'm going to be assuming that some sort of limited degree, you know the basic rules. So for example, you know what a point of information is, you know what I mean by rebuttal, you know how many teams there are in the BP format and how many speakers there are and stuff like that. If you don't know those things, if you're watching this on any kind of recording, I would encourage you to go back and sort of check over that for yourselves. Now, this is with an accompanying PowerPoint that I'm having a little bit of trouble making. Sort of making visible to you guys. I'll just try to open up here and see. So you guys will be able to view this afterwards, but I'm basically just going to be using it as sort of essentially fairly basic notes. So it's important to understand basically what you're trying to do in the whip speech, because a lot of people often try to do the wrong things in the whip speech, right? So the first thing that you're trying to do in the whip speech is you're not just trying to show that your side of the motion is true or untrue, right? Of course, that's part of it. That's a useful way to think about it, but it's not exactly what you're trying to do. And secondly, and relatedly, you're not attempting in any meaningful way to demonstrate that the other teams are necessarily untrue. Again, of course, you can do this, but it's not your goal. Your goal is to show that your extension is the most important set of arguments in the debate. Now, the reason that this distinction is quite important is because you are able to totally jettison everything that the opening half team on your bench has said and still win the debate, even if your contribution is not as important as that of the opposition bench. So if I can give you kind of an example, you're totally able to get away with making the, let's say you're closing opposition, you can make the opening opposition team look like absolute crap, and then let's say opening government was quite good, so you marginally get in front of them, and closing government was also quite good, so you only marginally get in front of them. You still win the debate, even though the opposition team has lost, right? Like the adjudicator would come away from the debate unconvinced that it's a good idea, that it's a bad idea. They would think the government bench has won, but you've still won the debate. So from an objective perspective, you're doing something kind of unusual. You're not actually trying to persuade the person that the motion is true. You're rather trying to prove that your extension was the best. And this also, as we're going to see, has big implications for the way that you write and the way that you think about the whip speech. You're able to ignore big sections of the debate if they're not convenient for you or if they're not handy for you or anything like that. So let's check out, let's have a think about the essential jobs that you're doing, okay? And what I mean by essential jobs is in the whip speech, there are a lot of things that are good to do, okay? Or there are a lot of things that could be helpful to you. But there are two things that you absolutely must do. The first is that you must rebut the speaker that comes before you. And the second is that you must defend your own extension, okay? And what I mean by these things are, by rebutting the speaker before you, I mean you simply don't have a choice. You need to make sure that you are rebutting that person, whether it be the opposition member or the government whip. You need to be doing a fair bit of work to rebut them. So whenever you're writing the whip speech in the remainder of the debate, you need to leave yourself an absolute minimum of 2 minutes in which to rebut them, and ideally a little bit more because it might take time. And when it comes to defending your extension, that means that the first thing you need to do is comb through the debate and see if there's anything that's kind of relevant to your extension and make sure that you're rebutting it. And what I mean by that is that your extension might rebut other things, but you need to make sure that you are rebutting everything that could challenge whether or not your extension is true. The reason that you need to do these things is basically because as far as it goes to rebutting the speaker before you, it's a simple matter of logistics that you're the only speaker who can, right? You're the last speaker on the government bench or on the opposition bench, as it may be. And so the speaker who goes before you, if you don't rebut them, literally no one else will. Whereas, even if you're like member, right? If you're op member and you don't rebut the opposition extension, you know that your whip can do that. Whereas nobody can rebut the person that has spoken before you except for yourself. And when it comes to defending the extension, The reason that that's the most important job is because, simply put, it needs to be the case that your extension has had all attacks against it sort of defeated, because otherwise you will just lose the debate. Simple as that. You need to have a unique extension. Now, critically, in terms of explaining these kind of essential jobs a little bit more, the government whip speaker and the opposition whip speaker kind of have slightly different burdens here, okay? So for the gov whip speaker, you have a pretty high burden to rebut the opposition's extension kind of clearly and early and deeply and with as much time as you can spare, okay? So I believe that a lot of people here wouldn't have done the Australasian format, but it gives you kind of a useful primer to the gov whip speech with regards to the reply speech, right? So the reply speech is like a 4-minute summary speech in which you explain why your team has won the debate. And I think that that is a good way to think about how long your whip speech should be, except for your rebuttal to the closing opposition team. So the way I've always thought it's easiest to talk about closing government whip speakers is that you need to basically spend about 3 to 4 minutes explaining why you've won the opening half of the debate. And then you need to devote at least the first 3 minutes in your speech to rebutting closing opposition. And to be honest, you can't get to this early enough, right? So if closing opposition is really bad, all right, you may need to spend less time. If closing opposition is pretty good, particularly if the opening half wasn't so good, you may need to spend a lot more time. It may be overwhelmingly the most important thing. But even if they're terrible, you can't get away with just not rebutting them. The reasons for this are basically the closing opposition is a tricky position for closing government to deal with, because closing opposition is in a position in which even if their member speaker is quite bad, if you don't rebut them enough, their whip speaker can get up there, defend them from the kind of bad, limited rebuttal that you've done, re-explain the extension, maybe provide some new links and some new analysis, and then boom, presto, they've won the debate. Now, if you spend enough time rebutting them, if you spend your 2 to 3 minutes, it'll be harder for them to do that, because the op whip will need to scrap a lot of that attempt and will need to spend heaps of time rebutting you, right? But if you don't do it and you just give them the opportunity, you might find that op whip is winning the debate a surprising amount of the time. Now, the other reason that you need to do it is that it's simply the most important job, right? It's absolutely crucial from a role fulfillment perspective, because nobody else in the entire debate rebuts closing opposition. So they will very often come out of the member speech seeming like they have won the debate. Quite rare, in fact, for you to think anything else. So, there is an exception to this, okay? And the exception to this is not when the closing opposition is bad. If the closing opposition team is bad, then you should spend a fair bit of time just dunking on them, like at least a minute, just being like, here's a couple of quick responses that we think are super, super, super kind of obvious and that we think are going to get us the win in this debate. The exception to this actually comes in the circumstance in which it's obvious closing opposition is going to win the debate, right? And the reason for that is because if closing opposition is very clearly going to win the debate, then what that in practice means is that, how do I put this? If they're going to win, you need to make sure you don't lose, right? And you've got to remember that in BP debating, it's just as good to get a first from a second, to move from a second to a first, as it is to move from a fourth to a third, right? So if you're not going to win the debate, you need to make sure that you're getting that second or you're getting that third. You got to, really, the way that breaking, particularly royalty, works is that it's actually quite hard to break if you get a donut on the final day. So in Australia, we call a donut the getting a zero. I'm sure some of you guys do as well. But if you get a donut on the last day of the tournament, right, it is difficult for you to break no matter what. And the reason for this is that if you get a donut on the last day, you need to get 2 wins to make up for it. And we all know that even if you're the best, getting 2 wins with the amount of luck that's involved in that is kind of arbitrary. So you don't have much room to move unless you've been crushing it and you're so far above the pack that you're going to be fine. So in order to kind of do this, you need to make sure that you're avoiding those donuts. And the best signal that you've got to avoid a donut is that closing opposition is going to win the debate by a ton. And the reason that that matters is in that circumstance, you need to firstly rebut them whenever they rebutted you, You need to put up a fight in terms of rebutting their extensions. You can't let it go away unremarked, but you got to leave something alive. And then you got to spend as much time as possible attacking whichever other team you're going to try to beat in the debate. Cool. So I hope all of this is making sense. If you guys want to put any questions in the chat, I'm sort of checking it periodically, like at the end of each thing. I know that all of this is kind of getting very abstract so far, but I think it's really important to just clearly state what your priorities need to be and the reasons that your priorities need to be those things, because I think a lot of people, when they give the whip speech, treat it a little bit like they're giving the Deputy Prime Minister speech, right? Where they're like, I want to do a lot of rebuttal. And the problem with that approach is that the whip speech happens so late in the debate and there's been so much material that the likelihood that you're actually in practice going to be able to rebut all of that stuff is almost zero, right? Which means that you need a good mechanism in order to ensure that you're able to rebut everything that you want to rebut. And I think that this gives you kind of the useful set of tools to be able to do so. So let's talk about what whipping means, because obviously it's called a whip speech, and yet all I've spoken about now are basically some specific things that you should be rebutting. And the thing about rebutting is that, like, it's kind of situation specific. You know, like you can give me an argument, and I might be able to tell you how I would rebut it, but ultimately it's one of those things that you know when you see. I think whipping's different because there is kind of a finite number of tools that you have available to you in which you're able to explain why arguments are more important or kind of contingent on one another. So in looking at these, I'm going to look at two sort of central techniques. One is impacting, and the other is about the idea of a central issue. Okay, so impacting is basically what you do when you have a novel extension, right? So I'm actually looking through the chat, and I see there are some questions on like analysis extensions as compared to other kinds of extensions and things like that. Basically, you do impacting whenever you've got a harm that you think is like yours, right? So for example, a very obvious idea of a novel extension, right, might be where it's appropriate to use impacting, might be if you're doing the topic that we would ban drugs and the opposition team comes out, so your opening comes out and says, well, people have a right to use drugs. And you come out and say, well, drug criminalization makes drugs unsafe, right? Let's assume that that's actually happened in the debate. That would be a totally novel extension. Yeah, I am speaking. Can you guys not hear me? So no one else can hear me? Okay, cool, easy. So in that case, it's a totally novel extension, right? As in, there is a consequence that for your team is only attributable to you and is not attributable in any other way to another team. Divorce that from the idea of, say, an analysis extension where you're providing more reasons for something already being true. In that circumstance, what you're trying to do is explain why your argument is the most important argument in the debate. Now, I think probably the most useful thing that I have for you in this session is a list of reasons that are kind of generic that arguments are important. And as I'm going to get to, I'm going to explain each of these reasons, and I'm going to kind of try to give you a bit of a sense of where you can use them. My advice to everyone, though, would be it's kind of helpful to have a list of whatever you think the reasons arguments are important next to you when you're the whip speaker, because then when you're comparing and contrasting arguments, you've automatically got the reference for what it is, right? So you might say, the opposition made this argument, but even if it's true, it's not important because blah, whereas our argument is important because blah. Okay, and this is like the bread and butter of good whip speeches, explaining why arguments are more important than others. And there are 5 reasons, I think, that are kind of generically true that arguments are more important than others. The first is really simple. It's the idea that an argument impacts a really large number of people. Now, the intuition behind this is extraordinarily simple. If you had to choose between one random person suffering horribly or 2 random people suffering horribly, I think you'd probably select one random person suffering horribly instead of 2. And the reason is simply that we all kind of agreed that certus paribus, it would be better if fewer people were to suffer rather than more. So showing that your argument is broad in scope is, as a result, really important in terms of establishing its importance. The second argument is the idea that the argument impacts people very deeply. So let's look at a useful kind of intuition here. You probably wouldn't give everyone let's say you had the opportunity to give everyone in the world $5, and in exchange, you had to torture one innocent person horribly for a year. Now, a year's not that long, right? Like it's not a whole life. And having $5 is not bad, right? Like that gives the people opportunity to sort of buy something. However, I think we can all agree that if a harm is very intense, it matters much more than one that is fleeting, right? Like I think we would all basically agree that you should not torture someone in order to give everyone $5, even though I guess utilitarianism might tell us that it is kind of a good idea. The third is the idea that the argument lasts for a long time. It's a mathematical extension of the premise that doing something to 100 people for 1 hour or 100 people for 10 hours are basically, or 10 people for 10 hours are basically indistinguishable. It's happening for the same number of hours, right? Especially if the harm lasts long enough for it to affect the next generation of people, then you're really onto a winner with your harm. Because now, in addition to affecting a large number of people in like a timescale sense, it's also affecting people that are in the next generation who are innocent, which means, as I'm going to get to in a moment, there's kind of some principled significance to them being harmed. Okay. The fourth reason that an argument can be important is kind of related to the plausibility of the argument. So to give you an example, in almost any debate, you could technically tie it to the idea that there's going to be a nuclear war or something like that, right? And that's, of course, plausibly somewhat true. But in almost every debate, the likelihood of nuclear war is so vanishingly low that in practice, it's not really a harm that you need to deal with or care about very much. Juxtapose that, however, to an argument that's maybe smaller in scale, but very likely, you tend to care more about the likely argument. So, and the final one, of course, is that an argument has principled significance. Now, I don't know if you guys are familiar with the language of contingent and non-contingent moral arguments, right? So a contingent moral argument is the idea that if something were to happen, it would be morally good or bad. A non-contingent moral argument is the idea that something is good or bad by itself. It doesn't matter whether or not it's actually got any sort of moral significance. The reason that I say that difference is because people like to knock contingent moral arguments, right? So an example of the difference is if you're doing a debate about the environment, you can often make the argument that we owe a principled obligation to the environment to protect it, right? Because the environment is filled with, for example, innocent creatures or something like that, yeah? And then if you're doing a debate about torture, you might say, well, we've got an obligation to not torture people because it violates their human rights. So to go through those two, if the debate is like that we would ban messing with the environment or that we would ban torture, then your principle is non-contingent because the topic just says that we should stop doing those things. And so your principle is all you need to prove. However, if the topic is that the environmental movement should aim to better protect the environment through the use of terrorism, or if the torture debate is that doctors on CIA bases should refuse to treat people who have been substantially injured by torture because they're going to get taken back and tortured again, right? If those are your topics, it's not good enough to just say, well, these things are immoral. In order for that principle to matter, it needs to be principally related. The reason that I say this is a lot of people noting this difference tend not to make these sorts of principled arguments. And I think that's a shame because they're still very useful for impacting, right? So if a principle is substantially contingent, but is nonetheless still an important principle, then more often than not, you're able to use it to explain why it's more important than another argument in the debate. Now, it doesn't make sense for you always to use all 5 of these because usually your opposition's argument will be good on one of these metrics as well. But it's often useful to point out, for example, that the opposition's argument, let's say it's not that intense and it's short term, okay? Or you might say it affects a very small number of people and it's not very intense, but it is long term. And then if you can compare that to your argument and you can be like, and yeah, our argument lasts for ages and is very long term, then even if everything else is true, you're still actually probably going to win the debate, right? Because you've still substantially demonstrated the consequence that you wanted to demonstrate in the way that you wanted to demonstrate it, which is to say that it is extremely long term and sort of extremely significant. So I hope that bit about impacting sort of makes sense. Yep, there we go. So so the way that you do this is very simple, right? So you know how you have there's kind of two ways to structure a whip speech, right? One of them is just to have like I'm going to rebut this team, then I'm going to rebut this team, and that's totally fine. And in that case, at the end of each kind of point of rebuttal, what it's good to do is to compare and contrast your material with that of the opening opposition or that of the closing opposition or whoever, and be like, we told you this and it had these properties. The opposition tells you this and they do not have these properties. They don't have anything to say for themselves, right? And that means that you can explain your arguments are more important. And that's crucial to do at some point in the whip speech, at least once with regards to your extension. Because what this kind of impacting does is it both establishes that your extension is by itself very important, and by juxtaposing it to other things, it's very good for explaining why the opposition's team is not very effective. So to give you a very basic example of this, let's say again we're doing the debate about torture, right? So let's just lay out a fictional debate for ourselves. Let's say opening government has said torture doesn't work and it alienates our allies. Let's say opening opposition says torture generates valuable information. Let's say closing government demonstrates that it's principally immoral to torture people, and closing opposition tries to demonstrate that it's actually good because the people that we're torturing deserve to be punished, right? So I think we can all agree that closing opposition, you would rebut directly. You would say, well, torture, nobody can deserve it, right, if you believe our material about a violation of human rights, so it definitionally can't be fair. And you might also point out that torture involves a lot of innocent people being tortured, okay? And that sort of similarly, we have a question. I'll get to that in just a moment. And sort of similarly, it's immoral. But with the opening opposition argument, what you're trying to do is compare your moral argument to the opposition's argument about how this would be able to save people, right? And the thing that you could say is the problem with opening opposition's argument is that it is incredibly rare. Torture usually doesn't generate much useful information, and it's very uncomparative. In the circumstances in which it would have generated information, it's likely that the person would have broken anyway and given it to you eventually just because interrogation is actually pretty effective. Juxtapose that to our extension, because literally more frequently than yours, and as a result, it is more important. Now, if you were to flip these things, you could also juxtapose it in the opposite way, right? You could say, look, the opposition is afraid that this will implicate people in something immoral, but they haven't thought about the scope of this because terrorism is able to kill huge numbers of totally innocent people, whereas although the opposition's harm is undoubtedly true and it's fairly common, it doesn't affect that many people because, you know, the number of people that we want to torture is probably in the tens, whereas each time a terrorist attack goes, it can kill hundreds of people. Right. Oh, okay. So what happens in the debates where most arguments are contested upon by both teams, have more or less the same arguments, so impacts, but the contentions are basically in the mechanisms of the arguments and rebutting the analysis? That's a question from Hasif, and it is a sensible one because it is it's not an easy question to answer. I'm going to try to answer it here, however, with my notion of centrality, right? So the first thing is you truly cannot impact. You cannot use the impacting strategy in this kind of debate. And this kind of debate, although it's usually not the only thing, it will be like a very, very common kind of area of the debate, okay? So what you're trying to demonstrate at closing, the first thing I would say is that this is not good advice that I'm going to give you. It's not good advice for judging. To be honest, I struggle to judge this kind of clash in which, let's say, maybe if I can rephrase that question very slightly, it's a clash in which both of the, or actually to maybe be a bit more specific, let me give you a concept that I find very useful for understanding a lot of arguments in debates, right? So for arguments to be relevant in debates, you need an argument to be both necessary and sufficient, okay? So if I can give you an example here, if we're doing the debate about invading a country, right? A necessary but insufficient condition for that is proving that it is justified to invade that country, right? And similarly, a necessary but insufficient condition is proving that invading that country will bring about a positive change. You need to prove both of those things. And once you've demonstrated that it's substantially just to invade the country and that it will have positive change, you have then substantially demonstrated that the policy is in fact a fair one. But until you have demonstrated both of those things, neither of your points individually amounts to anything. Now, that's an oversimplification of Hasif's question, which is an instance in which both teams are providing substantial amounts of analysis, all right, that are essentially proving something very similar. But the reason that I bring this up is because the basic way that you do this, the arguments contested upon by both teams have the same impacts, but the question is about the mechanisms, is that you need to find a way to uncharitably characterize your opening's arguments as being necessary but insufficient, and you need to characterize their case as being incomplete without your analysis, okay? And the easiest way to do this is to actually turn to the opening opposition or closing opposition team's rebuttal of your opening team, okay? So what it's useful to do is be like, opening government, sorry everyone, I had a big day. Opening government establishes this very, very high threshold. And they are not wrong, establishes this very, very big problem. But then their ability to demonstrate that they fix this problem simply falls short. And then you say, that's because, as opening opposition plausibly notes, blah, 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 blah. It's only when we come in and provide you with this additional analysis that you're actually confident that we're able to achieve this sort of outcome, right? So that's the first way in which that's the first kind of two ways in which you can do it, okay? So the first way that you can do it is that you can explain that their analysis is necessary but insufficient. The second way in which you're able to get around it is in demonstrating that they've been rebutted too much and as a result shouldn't really be trusted. And in that case, you need instead to be the analysis that's sort of the most important in the debate, right? So those are kind of the first two strategies that I think you have available to you in order to do this. The third is kind of the idea of proving that your arguments are more sophisticated than theirs. And I think this is often kind of cheating. Like I think I think whenever I hear an adjudicator say that an argument was more sophisticated than an argument an opening team made, my mind does kind of immediately go to the idea of like, bias against non-native English speakers and bias towards men and stuff like that, because it's a very arbitrary metric about sophistication. And there's nothing inherently better about an argument that is sophisticated. Nonetheless, this isn't a class on how to be an equitable adjudicator. This is a class on how to win debates. And if you're a whip speaker, using the language of sophistication is enormously important in terms of ensuring that if you aren't maybe winning the debate, you're at least going to come second or you've at least got a big stake in it, all right? And the way in which you prove something is more sophisticated is basically you're accounting for more variables. So what I mean by that is, say, if you're being more sophisticated, that often looks like you do a comprehensive breakdown of the stakeholders, or that looks like you do an analysis of it through the long term and the short term, basically something that your opening didn't consider. And then you just be like, look, our opening gave you the simple version of this case, but that just wasn't good enough because it might have proved a small benefit, but it didn't really prove anything large enough to stand up to, what we're really concerned about and stuff like that. Juxtapose that to this policy, which of course is which of course is substantially more sophisticated. Sorry, not policy. This area, which is substantially more sophisticated, and as a result, likely to be far sort of more persuasive. So that's just a rhetorical tool that you're able to use to do this. However, the simplest one by far, is to use your extension to rebut the opposition team. Okay, so you want to say the opposition said this, but that's wrong for some reason that we said in here. And the reason for this is that if you're able to effectively rebut everything that the other two teams have said, it then stands to reason to believe that your case is far more important than the other teams, even if it does not intuitively seem to be the case that it's actually that much more important. And the reason for that is simply that one of the main metrics that we use to adjudicate this format, and in fact really all of the formats, right? In practice, you do need to, how do I put this? You do need to be engaging with the debate. And because you need to be engaging with the debate, the easiest way in which for you to do so is to very simply prove that you have rebutted everything that everybody has said. So I hope that's kind of a clear answer to your question, Hasif. Those are the strategies that I would recommend that you use. If you have any more questions at any point, guys, just put them in the chat. Or if you have any follow-ups to anything I've said or anything like that, or need me to repeat anything. Because I've still got a fair amount of stuff, but obviously it's far more, I think, productive. Yeah, beauty. It's far more productive for me to kind of be answering questions that you guys are interested in. So I want to now talk about points of information in the context of the whip speech, all right? And the reason that I want to talk about this is because I think a lot of people kind of get points of information wrong in the closing half. See, if you're in the opening half, points of information are absolutely crucial, all right? Because if you're in the opening half, when you take a POI and you take them from closing, they might tell you what their extension is, or at least tell you a problem with your case that you can shore up, right? So in the first place, they provide you with lots of useful information. But then when you're in opening half, your ability to ask points of information from the closing is the best opportunity that you have to inject material into the debate, all right? So if you're in opening, POIs rock and they're really important. The problem is, if you're in closing, as a result of this, POIs absolutely suck and should be abhorred, and we should do pretty much everything we can to ensure that they're not able to do any damage to you whatsoever. So I hope that makes sense. I hope that makes sense as to why they're not super important, right? What was I thinking? Let's explain how you do POIs without actually, without doing any damage to yourself, right? The first thing that you should say is that you should take points of information from the opening team, all right? And ideally, you should take them before you've begun rebutting them. So if you're in closing government, you should take them from opening opposition, and you should take them right after you have rebutted closing opposition, but not rebutted opening opposition. The reason for this is because if you do it after you've rebutted them, they can give you a specific response that explains why your piece of rebuttal was wrong. However, if you take them before you've rebutted them, they actually don't know what your rebuttal is. So they're most likely to say, like, in the POI, you made this argument, but don't you think that ignores this thing that we told you in our case? And if you've been doing even vaguely okay, then you're going to be totally fine, right? Like, you're going to get in absolutely no trouble because you just get to be like, well, the problem with the opposition's case is, the problem with that POI is that I've already got a piece of rebuttal prepared for it, right? Which means that you can then just say, well, this is the rebuttal that I already have prepared. Boom, I've already taken the POIs. Now, remember with POIs, they are trivial for closing opposition and closing government. They're not important. They never advantage you to take POIs. Don't take more POIs than you need to. Even if you're speaking short, don't take more POIs than you need to, because they present the opposition team with a free opportunity to rebut you. They present them with a huge amount of time in which they're able to effectively sort of take chunks out of you and stuff like that. And they give you very little advantage in order to do so. Now, final thing I want to talk is basically about some style stuff, all right? So everybody's obviously got their own style, and that's cool. So I'm not going to tell you anything about the way that you should be talking. I'm just going to tell you some stuff that I found helpful about at Whip, right? And I think there's like kind of three things. The first is that you got to force yourself to say, my partner said, as often as possible. Now, crucially, it doesn't matter if your partner said this or not, right? But every time you're saying something, whether it be a point of rebuttal, whether it be a bit of framing, whether it be a bit of summary, you need to be reminding the adjudicator that your partner said it. And the reason for that is because ultimately you're a whip, you're meant to be making your partner look good, and you're only really able to do that in the environment in which you just keep saying the same stuff that your partner said over and over. So that's sort of thing number one. Thing number two is that often your member speaker will have done some rebuttal, but it will have been very short, right? The best kind of thing that you can do from a team consistency perspective is to make sure that you're using rebuttal that your member speaker said and expanding upon that rebuttal instead of just kind of like doing an ordinary sort of thing. Instead of just doing new rebuttal yourself, right? Even if your rebuttal is like vastly different to theirs, it's still really important to, as much as possible, make sure that you're using rebuttal that's kind of novel. All right. Then the third thing that I would say about this is that often at Whip, it's very helpful to just have specific explanations. And what I mean by a specific explanation is just that obviously your opening team will be providing analysis and your member will be providing analysis. So what it's often good is to have a really good example that accommodates quite a lot of the ideas in the debate that demonstrates that your side of the motion is true. And the reason that that kind of example is incredibly important is because it allows your opposition to better visualize the things that you're describing in a way that means that they're subsequently likely to believe that they're more plausible and more truthful, and ultimately they're more likely to believe you if you have a good set of examples and a good set of specific explanations for these things. So I think at this point, we've all got a decent idea of how kind of elements of the whip speech works. The problem is that it's very difficult to explain the most central part of whipping, right? I've obviously given you components of it, as opposed to like what the speech overall is doing. And the reason for that is that the speech overall is extraordinarily difficult to homogenize, right? Every whip speech is totally different. And although you can come to some good explanations that are given in any one debate, and I could explain how I want you to do a whip speech for anything individually, I can't really tell you how you do them all. So what I want to do now is go through a case study of a kind of debate. And what I'm going to do is explain a lot of the common arguments that you can use in this kind of debate, and hopefully also give you a sense as to how in this kind of debate I think that you should focus on the whipping of this kind of debate. Okay, so I hope that sounds good. Obviously at this time, if you guys have any questions about that previous generic stuff, then let me know. But otherwise I'll just, I'll kind of maybe leave it for a second. Then I will jump straight into this stuff about this kind of debate. The kind of debate I'm talking about, by the way, is debates about decision making. And that'll probably bring us through to the end. So we're going to talk about some stuff to do with that. Cool, cool. All right, so let's get to it. So in terms of decision making, I want to focus on two areas when talking about decisions. The first is focusing on the question, are people providing consent when they're making decisions? And the second is, what kind of decisions do people make? So what I mean by consent in this context is quite simple. Consent simply means that your decisions align with your interests. Okay? So what I mean by an interest is basically something that you authentically want. Crucially, this does not prejudge the validity of these interests, sorry. It merely asks us to ask ourselves whether or not these interests are in fact, whether or not these choices that you're making are in fact aligned. And the difference that I'm saying there, right, is that you can, for example, have the quite genuinely held, quite authentic interest that you wish to have your head cut off, right, or that you wish to become a slave, or anything else, right? And you would obviously intuitively say, that's totally insane. That's totally crazy. However, consent does not judge the validity of your interests. It merely asks if you are sane and capable enough to make decisions that align with those interests. Now, sometimes your interests can be bad ones, right? But nonetheless, if you have them, they, broadly speaking, need to be followed. The reason that people's consent is important is for two reasons. The first is because if people are making decisions that only affect them and they have provided consent, it is not clear that the government has any right to interfere with their decision-making in that context. Okay, so it's not even clear that the government should be free to do these sorts of things. And secondly, if people have been proven to consent, then this means that they would be rationally pursuing their decisions, which means because they're rationally pursuing their interests, we can assume that the decision is utility maximizing. The reason that this is important, to draw it back to the things that we were talking about before, is that consent is sort of like the mechanism that then leads to these benefits, right? So it doesn't matter what kind of decision somebody makes. If they are consenting, then you can say these two things happen as benefits to these people. So the way that you might structure this in a whip speech is, let's say, your extension was about consent, which is, I think, a useful kind of extension, or your extension was about decision-making. You can say, the reason our extension is so important is because we, in demonstrating that these people have consented, both have demonstrated that it's wrong for the government to interfere with their decision-making and that their decision is presumably not utility maximizing. So I hope both of those sort of make sense to you. You can ask me questions if you want. Now, a good example of any debate about consent is any debate about sin taxes, right? So, for example, that we would impose something like a sugar tax, or that we would impose a tax on alcohol or anything like that. And the reason for that, right, is that if people can be proven to be consenting to those things, which are obviously harmful for your long-term health, but nice in terms of your long-term enjoyment, then it's very easy for you to get up and say, well, look, people have consented, which means they clearly care more about the long-term benefits than the short-term harms. Because they clearly care about the long-term benefits more than the short-term harms, the short-term benefits more than the long-term harms, it's wrong for the government to try to restrict people from doing whatever they want, which means even if a sugar tax would be maybe, in your view, the best, it's clearly not what these people have decided, and thus it's not something that we should prioritize. So that's just what I'm really talking about there, right? Now, in terms of where we start, we usually begin by assuming that people are rational, self-interested actors in which consent is present for these people. And we then start to break it down a bit. So the first thing that we like to look at is we establish what people's priorities are, right? Or we establish what their interests are. And there are actually lots of ways in which you to establish what someone's interests might be, right? So the first is that you can use like a narrative. So you can tell me a story of this person's life and be like, hey, it sure does seem like this person is, their interests are this certain thing. And that's a good strategy. The second thing that you can do is you can use deduction. So you can be like, these actors have behaved in this way before, thus it implies they have this priority. And the third way that you can do it is from testimony. So you can say, well, they've told us that this is their priority, and we should, of course, believe them because we should generally believe people when they tell us like kind of who they are and stuff like that. So once you've figured that out, so you've assumed they're basically self-interested and you've figured out roughly what their interests are and what their priorities are, step 3 is then to look firstly at the kind of information that they have available to them. And it's crucial to do this in a way that is both explicit and implicit, right? So when you're talking about explicit, it's like, what literally do they know? Like, what have they been told by the people around them? When it comes to implicit information, you're doing something much more like, what are they preconditioned to assume on the basis of the media context that they exist in? Just as an example. So say, if you watch a lot of Fox News, you, in addition to having maybe slightly different knowledge to other people, you also have slightly different emphases and stuff like that on the rest of the on the rest of the world. Cool. Let's now talk basically about some things to do with demographics that stop you from being able to make very good decisions. Okay, and this is getting into kind of more how people don't have consent, because as we've shown previously, if you don't have good information, you definitionally don't have good consent. So step 3 means you don't have good consent. But step 4 on this demographic stuff gets a bit closer to ways in which people don't have good consent. The first is with regards to the idea of epistemic gaps. So basically the concept that people can have difficulty understanding the experiences of those different to them. So it really does refer to the idea that we can't understand the inner life of anyone, but it also explains how we can't understand people that are very different to us. This can be applied in many different ways. So for example, how in domestic settings, people frequently fail to properly empathize with their partners and have unneeded fights, but most commonly refers to the ways in which those with social privilege struggle to properly empathize to those without social privilege. Okay, so you might say decision makers are not able to make decisions on behalf of other people because even though they have factual information, their epistemic gap from those people makes it extraordinarily difficult for them to understand the differences in the way that they think to the way that other people think in a way that is actually extraordinarily hard for them. The second one of these is basically age. So advanced age is an advantage in decision making as it confers experience, which as we now know is really important, until it's not, right? So people as a general rule experience substantial mental decay that can play on many factors like your memory, your intelligence and rational decision making, your perception of reality, for example, with regards to dementia. Now, with regards to youth, of course, the same thing happens. Young people lacking the experience of the world to properly understand consequences tend to struggle to make proper decisions. So you could kind of, I guess, conceptualize of good decision-making as resembling loosely like a bell curve. You know, like as you progress through your life, you improve and you improve and you improve until you start getting worse and worse and worse. And then eventually you're kind of back where you were when you were a baby. All right. And the next one is basically to do with mental illness. The exception that I would make here, right, is that mental illnesses are all different. And if you can prove that some group or some individual tends to have some form of mental illness, you can say some things about them, but you can't say everything about them. So for example, somebody who has anxiety might make decisions poorly under stressful contexts, but if given the appropriate amount of time to think about it, might be able to make very good long-term decisions. Because we know that anxiety amplifies the amount of stress that people feel in stressful situations, but doesn't actually change the way in which they feel in general. Depression might make people unwilling to expend any energy on something, but it might actually not, so they might not make decisions in their own interests, but they still might be capable of performing rational analysis on the world. Or for example, a lot of depressed people are still very good at thinking about the people that they care about, and they're very good like kind of friends, even though they're bad at a lot of other things. And finally, bipolar people may struggle to stick to good patterns due to their huge mood swings, right? So if you're bipolar, that then means naturally that you change your opinions and you change your approach to the world much more than kind of a neurotypical person tends to. And as a result of that sort of rapid escalating shift, you're highly likely to, into the medium term, make decisions that are very kind of inconsistent and thus not in accordance with your worth. Okay, so those are some reasons that individual specific groups of people are very bad at making kind of decisions in some cases, or can be very good as well. Now, what I want to look at here is ways in which people in their everyday life struggle to make decisions well, right? So this is basically showing that people are, even if they're, you know, like perfectly epistemically placed and they're at the right age and all this stuff, still often totally screw their decisions up. The first reason is just insufficient information. As we've spoken about before, this makes the prediction of upside and downside impossible, which is kind of crucial. The second is the idea of insufficient time, because with time and the lack of pressure that hurry induces, people are better able to properly consider the details of their decisions. And the reason that that's quite important is that without that free time, people are prone to overlook important consequences, which may otherwise sway the way in which they perform that individual decision. The third reason is the idea of experience. Decision-making is not easy. It's a skill learned over time with extensive repetition. When there are choices that we make all the time, for example, that we know what to eat, we have extensive experience in making that kind of decision, which means we can quickly and accurately determine what we do want to eat. When it's a decision that we're unfamiliar with, so for example, you know, like questions about end of life, which definitionally most people don't have a lot of experience with, we're quite likely to be error prone. And finally, intense emotion, because it's difficult to keep a cool head under pressure, and people feeling intense emotion will struggle to weigh benefits and costs in a way that is actually kind of accurate, in a way that means that if you're very stressed out, you're highly likely to end up making the kind of wrong decision, okay? So all of these just are constitutive of reasons that everyday people screw up certain kinds of experiences, and I think they kind of constitute a case as to why some decisions are likely to be screwed up by everyone. So the next thing to talk about are cognitive biases. Now, I'm not a psychologist or a neuroscientist or anything, but it's kind of useful to think about cognitive biases, particularly when there are more than one in operation, because they're very good explanations as to why, in some kind of circumstance, people predictably make bad decisions. So to give you some kind of good examples of these, the first might be that people have a short-term bias, so the idea that they should care more about things happening in the short rather than the long term. The second is an incrementalism bias, so the idea that people struggle to account for decisions which, when performed repeatedly, are very harmful, but in which individually do no harm and are fun. So a good example is overeating or overdrinking. It's obviously fine to do it occasionally, and no individual case of abstinence will help with your health, but as a pattern of behavior, it will absolutely kill you. So it's kind of important that you're cognizant of that, even though in individual cases, they don't necessarily do anything super bad to you. The third is the idea of conservatism bias. So it's the idea that people are very bad at accommodating for new information which conflicts with their present worldviews. So if you have a large amount of kind of internal, if you have a very strongly held belief about, say, something like, say, Donald Trump being great, right? And then you get new information that makes Donald Trump look bad, you're highly likely to disregard that new piece of information, which is, of course, extremely dangerous for you as a person, but also dangerous for the people around you. The next one is with regards to closeness bias. So we tend to care more about people that we're close to than people further away from us. That's obviously totally fine when it comes to, say, family, right, or friends. Like, of course, you're going to care more about your family or your friends. But it also means that we tend to code people's closeness in terms of things like whether or not they're racially similar to you, whether or not they live in the same country to you, their sexual orientation and whether or not it aligns with yours, and their gender and whether or not it aligns with yours. So closeness bias is a contributing factor for racism because we naturally feel more distant from people that we're different to than the same. And the final one is risk aversion. Many people are prone to overvalue perceived risk when the harms would be substantial, even if it is sufficiently unlikely that they hypothetically would be victim to it, that doesn't make sense. So if I can give you an example, right? If somebody said you need to go play a game of, let's say, like, this is a tortured example, but if somebody said you've got to go play a game of Russian roulette in which there's a 1 in 1,000 chance that the bullet will land in your head, right? And then conversely, you say, if you go play that game, you have a 1 in 1,000 chance of dying, but you're guaranteed to get $100 million. I reckon, personally, that the guarantee of total freedom from financial dependence would mean that it's probably a good idea to go play, because 1 in 1,000 is an insignificant chance. And yet, nonetheless, a huge number of people would not make that kind of decision, and as a result would probably, I think, screw it up in a sense, and would be far less likely to make the correct decision in that case. So there is also a problem with cognitive biases, which is that it's very difficult for people to actually understand their own cognitive biases. So people have what's known as a cognitive bias blind spot, which is a tendency to see yourself as less biased than others, or to be able to identify cognitive biases in others more easily than yourself. There's this idea of choice supportive bias, which is the idea of the tendency to remember your choices as better than they actually were, and the idea of the Dunning-Kruger effect, the tendency for unskilled individuals to overestimate their own ability, and the tendency for experts to underestimate their own ability. I believe that last one is basically because if you don't know anything, then you're highly likely to think that you don't know how much you don't know. Whereas if you're an expert, you will know how much you don't know, which means you won't consider yourself anywhere close to expert. Cool. Now, it's very important to remember that when you're talking about decision making, there's a distinction between kind of the way the average decision will be made and the way outlying decisions will be made. So this characterization is majoritarian. Everybody makes mistakes, and that means that if you're proving that people consent to something in general, you need to be able to explain why it's acceptable for at least a small minority of people to screw that up. So for example, if we were saying that the topic is that we should legalize people opting into slavery, right? You could prove that the vast majority of people consent to that. Like, I don't think you actually could, but let's say you do. If the negative correctly points out that if some people screw this up, they're then slaves, which is awful, then it doesn't matter that you were able to consent to it, because the small number of people who didn't really consent because they made a mistake are screwed. They're slaves now. Their lives are over. So I think it's useful to remember that. Your harms still need to be gated to the idea of acceptability, because if somebody screws this decision up, then you've kind of lost there, all right? Now, in terms of how this sort of all works out, this comes into tons and tons of debates, right? It kind of trivially comes into tons of debates. Oh, do we need to break these terms down, or do we need to simply state them? It's a good question. Depends how much time you've got, So Dunning-Kruger effect, you will need to explain what that is, right? Choice supportive bias, you will need to break down what that is. But other ones of these, like short-term bias or conservatism bias, right? Those things I think you can kind of get away with using as terms. The kind of simplest advice I would give you, right, is just put your first speaker out there and have them just use the terms. And if everybody seems to not understand, then you at WIP or at Deputy can just explain these things. It is kind of a complex one. Like if you ever have me as a judge, you can just use them. But, like in general, I think you probably do want to give a bit of an explanation because they're not sufficiently commonly known. Like, how the standard in a debate is, I love you. The standard in a debate is, sorry, my girlfriend just left the room. How the standard in a normal debate is kind of like the average reasonable person. For the average reasonable person test to really function, you need to be proving it to a reasonable doubt for an average reasonable person. All of these terms are not necessarily known to the average reasonable person, but their explanations are plausible to the average reasonable person, which I think is kind of like why you would probably want to make sure that you are in fact proving these things. Cool. So this stuff's really important for a ton of debates, and it's kind of important for two reasons. So the first is the one that I got to earlier, right? If you can prove that people consent to something, then you have proven that it is kind of legitimate for the government to restrict it. Sorry, illegitimate for the government to restrict it, and you've shown that restrictions will be bad for at least a majority of people. All right, so that's great if you can prove that. That's awesome. That rules. However, all of this analysis is still incredibly helpful if you want to use it to explain how people will behave. So for example, all of these arguments are incredibly useful in any debate about democracies, because in literally any debate about democracies, you're just trying to explain the way that people are most likely to behave. And in these sorts of debates, kind of obviously, you need to really be making sure that you're locked in as possible to detailed reasons that people will behave or vote or whatever in a certain way. So that seems to me to be sort of like a fairly intuitive explanation of why it matters. But you can use all of these mechanisms to explain these things. So a good example of this, right, is if we were doing the topic that we should abolish the police, right, and we're on the affirmative, what you want to characterize here is that police officers are prone to make bad decisions. And so the takeaways that come about as a result of this are kind of like fourfold, right? So from the analysis that we've already done, you can say, firstly, and this is selection effect in police officers. You chose to become a police officer because you want to enforce the law, and that means that at an absolute minimum, you're comfortable with the idea of hurting a lot of people or arresting a lot of people or whatever. Of course, a minority, but a substantial minority of the people that are selecting into this are in fact highly likely to be people that actually want to go out and commit violence. But let's just say with the easier characterization of people that are okay with it. Secondly, there is a groupthink bias, right? So everybody around you, probably a lot of them have engaged in violence. And so you at least probably are likely to think that it's kind of okay. Thirdly, they tend to be racist because they're exposed to disproportionate rates of crime and they're forced to over-police areas filled with ethnic minorities, which gradually forms in these people opinions that are racist. And then fourthly, the context in which they make the decision is one in which they are making short-term, fear-based decisions in which they are highly stressed and incapable of thinking clearly. So what we've done here is we've established who these people are. We've established kind of loosely what their interests are. We've established a big part of the way in which they think. And then we've done a decent examination of the contexts into which they're thinking, which then do a good job subsequently explaining the ways in which these people are likely to end up shooting a huge number of people. So that's the end of my presentation. I hope it kind of makes sense to you both from the whipping perspective, all right, but also from the decision-making perspective, which is important for both first and second speakers, but I think often provides useful grounds for an extension. So if anybody has any questions, I'll just stay on here for sort of a couple of minutes and I can answer those as they come through. And I'm really happy to just do that until we go. Great. Oh, yeah. Does somebody drop an extension by mistake? Did the whip get to cover it? Nope. I know it's a niche question. Sorry, it's like the answer to this question in a formal sense is like, no, you can't use it. And the reason that you can't use it, even if it's really important, is because it would be new in your speech. So you can try to sneak it in, right? So for example, what I would encourage your team strategy to be is to have them if the clap happens, to say the name of the extension and as much as they can before they get clapped off. So, take 15 seconds, pound it out. That's if it's vital to your extension. However, if it's vital to your whip speech. However, like in general, no. If the member of government or member of opposition drops one extension, you just need to deal with it. You just need to be okay with not delivering it. Like a good example of this actually is the World's 2019 secret basement final, obviously, which they kind of held a bit stupidly in secret. That debate's a funny one because the team that won the debate, Sydney D, obviously they're quite good in the debate. It's not a bad one to watch, but the team that won originally had, I think, like 3 points of extension, and the member speaker got so into the first one that he didn't do the other two, basically. And what that meant was that Boston, who was the whip speaker, had to entirely rewrite his speech immediately after Kevin sat down and as he was sitting down because he realized that he wasn't going to get to all of the bits of extension. So, you just need to sort of learn to live with it. There's not a lot, I'm afraid, that you're able to do. Cool. Do we have any other questions? I don't know what all these noises are. Oh, anything in particular to improve your analysis skills? I mean, like, honestly, the best thing to do to improve your analysis skills is probably like to read academic papers on a broad range of things, I think. Like, because basically debating is all downstream from academia, right? Like all the best debaters, everybody studies at university. Everybody is constantly like reading stuff on Vox and stuff like that. And in reality, it's like with analysis, right? Ooh, that's a good question. I'll answer it in a sec. With analysis, right? What you're all you're doing is you're establishing to yourself how thoroughly do I need to prove something, and the gold standard for that is in academic papers. So in my opinion, you want to read in whatever field interests you. Not so much reading for the content, although the content is great, but you're also trying to read to figure out like how thoroughly they prove stuff. You know, like where they decide it's important to have like a bit of research and stuff like that. You know, so I hope that makes sense. Because I think that they are the clearest example of where you can do it. Now, note taking as a whip speaker, this is something I've kind of long struggled with. I might come back to that analysis skills question because I'm kind of bubbling on some more ideas. But yeah, writing the whip speech is really hard because you don't really know what the extension is until it comes out. Like you think you know, but you don't. So the first thing that I would say is you during the Prime Minister and opposition leader's speech, you need to just basically be taking very detailed notes of their cases, all right? In particular, whichever one is on the diagonal from you. Then during whichever deputy speech in the is in the whichever deputy speech is in your bench, right? So if you're on if you're the government whip, then during the deputy speech, and then the gov deputy speech during the if you're op whip, then during the DLO speech, I think it makes sense to kind of turn off your brain a bit and start reading over those notes, right? So check what you've written for each team and then begin writing your framework for the speech, right? So I think it's usually good at WIP to have two issues and you want to allocate material between those two issues. You obviously want to have a vague idea of where your extension is going to fit into this. So you should by now have a loose idea what your member speak is going to be talking about. You should have a vague idea of like what I need to rebut and stuff like that. Okay. Those will form two of the three sheets of paper that I believe you should bring up with you. So you've got kind of like the issues as you're discussing them. And you've kind of got that done by the opening half, right? So you've put all of the material from the opening half into two or three issues, usually two because you don't have that long. And then you've got like your rebuttal to them and stuff like that. And because you've given yourself that 7 minutes during that deputy speech that you can ignore, and if you're at closing gov, you can just kind of listen into the DLO speech and just write rebuttal when it seems relevant, you know, because obviously a lot of the DLO speech is about trying to win the opening half, which you don't really care about too much. So you can kind of zone out for moments and write more stuff, okay? So then you've got your first half of the speech kind of written. You've explained the opening half. Then it changes a lot if you're in closing government or closing opposition.